The source where I originally found it says that it's written by an unknown author. So I thought, well, we live in a world of AI. Let me go see what my AI app, Perplexity, says. So I asked Perplexity who wrote this, and Perplexity said it was Edward Sanford Martin in a piece he wrote called My Name is Legion. So whether it was anonymous or whether it was Martin, I'm not totally sure. I know it wasn't me. But listen to these words and see if they don't capture some of the reality of your life as well as mine. Within my earthly temple, there's a crowd. There's one of us that's humble, one that's proud. There's one that's brokenhearted for his sins, and one that unrepentant sits and grins. There's one that loves his neighbor as himself, and one that cares for naught but fame and self. From such perplexing care I would be free if I could once determine which is me. Do you recognize yourself in that? That push and pull within you? That battle that Paul spoke of, I desire to do this, but I do that? That tug of war between the lighter side and the darker side, you relate to those words, which one is me? That very kind of battle can cause us to pull back and to hide, trying to present ourselves as more than we are. But we are all that. And that led to another one-liner, which again said anonymous. This time Perplexity told me, yeah, it's anonymous. We don't know who wrote it either. But listen to this one line. Everybody has a chapter they don't read out loud. It's true for me. Is that true for you? So what do we do with that? That experience of having that tug of war inside of us, mixed emotions, good choices, bad choices, darkness and light, and then having that chapter or 2 or 3 or 10 that we don't read out loud. What about that experience that causes us to want to pull back and hide? What do we call that? The word I would give to it is the word shame. Shame. So exactly how do we define shame? I would define shame as that deep and unfortunately powerful emotional reality that causes us to feel that in some way we're not okay, in some way we're defective, in some way we're not acceptable, in some way we need to remain in hiding. It's often distinguished from guilt by saying that when we feel guilty, we are typically able to determine what the source of that guilt is. I said this harshly. I was impatient in that case. I wasn't really honest with someone at work. And so then we go and try to make that right. We make an apology. We seek to make amends. We seek to repair the relationship. And if we follow through on all of that, then the guilt we are able to release and go back to living a healthy and a balanced life. Shame, however, is much more tenacious than that. It refuses to let us go, often having us in its grip and telling us things like, you're not worthy, you're not good, you're not defective, and especially, you're not acceptable. It's a surprisingly universal kind of experience. In fact, listen to the well-known movie actress Reese Witherspoon. She has been spoken of as not being one of the great actresses, but maybe one of the top actresses. Listen to what she writes and says. I don't watch any movie I'm in. It's horrifying. I'll just focus on something stupid like, I hate my laugh. Why did I smile? Sometimes I'll look at myself and think, dude, I have the biggest, goofiest smile on earth. And then she says, on particularly dark days, listen to what she does. Only in very dark moments, moments of pure self-loathing, do I type my name into Google. You never read anything positive. You always go straight to where they say something nasty about you. You're fat, you're ugly, you're tired, you're worthless. You don't have a career anymore. It's just an affirmation of every horrible feeling you have about yourself. Catch that last sentence. It's an affirmation of every horrible feeling you have about yourself. I don't know what you would call that. I would call that shame. Now, just to be sure, we recognize that shame is not the domain of the Hollywood glitterati and the secular world. It affects us as well. Consider this experience that Edward T. Welch talks about. Welch is a clinical psychologist, a Christian, counselor, author, and speaker. He tells about the experience of presenting on shame to a group of seminarians. He said there were about 100 there. Now, these were not just fresh out of college seminarians. These were more seasoned. They were into ministry. They had been around the block a couple of times. They knew life. And so Welch had shared a little bit about shame in his own life experience. And then he asked them a question I'm going to ask you, but I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands as he asked them to do. He asked them, have you recently had the experience of shame? Not a passing moment, but a moment that intruded into your thoughts, into your life, just with an overwhelming sense, I'm not worthy, I'm not acceptable, that incapacitated you for a little bit emotionally. Have any of you had that kind of experience? And Welch said that almost in unison, the entire group raised their hands. Incapacitating shame. Seems that it affects all of us at some point or another, in some way or another. So the question becomes, what do we do? How do we approach it? So we're finishing today a 3-part series entitled simply Songs for the Wounded Soul, a trilogy for when the days are dark and the nights are long. We've looked at 3 Psalms. Today is the 3rd one. We're going to look at Psalm 25 today, actually part of Psalm 25. Because the truth is, I want to say 2 things before we read from it that will help us understand it maybe a little bit better. So the first thing is to say that the tone of this psalm is different from the other 2 psalms we considered. The other 2 psalms, as you remember, were guttural, almost visceral cries for help. They started out saying things like, God, listen to me. Don't turn your back on me. Hear me. They were deep cries. This psalm, while it's deep and while it's powerful, is more peaceful. In fact, as I was thinking about it this week, I thought, you know, those other 2 psalms were kind of like a young person wailing away on an electric guitar. This psalm is like chemo playing a deep piece on the organ. Both have a message. Both are saying something, but in very different styles and tones. That's the first thing about Psalm 25. The second thing is it's hard to find a theme, a cohesive theme for the psalm. I read it and was trying to think, what exactly is that which draws this psalm all together? And I couldn't figure out what it was. I was comforted in going to the commentaries and finding Old Testament scholar after another saying, it's hard to find a theme in this psalm. Some do it, some don't. The reason for that is very simple. Psalm 25 is an acrostic psalm. By that I mean that the psalmist takes the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and each verse begins with a word that begins with that letter. In a sense, it's popcorn requests in prayer from A to Z. It would be like you sitting down at the beginning of a week and saying, I've got to pray about this week. I've got a lot on my plate. So you open a document on your computer, and in the left-hand column, you put all the letters of the alphabet from A to Z. And then you begin to fill in the right part with words beginning with each of those letters that capture a request you're making. Lord, I've got to have a conversation with my boyfriend, with my girlfriend today. I've been dreading this. Please help me to be authentic. That's your first one. And God, later this week comes that meeting with my boss. I'm threatened by my boss, but I've got to be honest. Help me to be bold. And for that matter, help me to be courageous. And you keep working your way through the letters of the alphabet, selecting those words that represent what you need to do. Lord, I've got to get this done this week. Help me to be determined. And with my neighbor, the one with whom we've struggled so much, help me to have empathy. So one word, one letter at a time, you're filling in the requests from your life. So then, if I were to choose a unifying theme for Psalm 25, it would be captured in one word, and that word is prayer. This is just prayer. Popcorn prayer. All the different needs all around my life, all around my world, presented to God. So in this context, we're going to focus on just one of the themes the psalmist raises, because the psalmist will go in a number of different directions throughout this psalm. The one on which we focus is the one with which he begins, and that's shame. Shame. He will circle around back to it toward the end. But he begins right out of the starting gate dealing with the issue of shame. This morning, I want to say just two things about shame. The first thing I would like to say is that shame fears exposure. Shame fears exposure. In other words, shame causes us to hide, to not be known for our true self, to try to say, well, that's not really me, this is me. Shame doesn't want to be seen for what it really is. It fears exposure. Notice how the psalmist begins. Verse 1, Psalm 25. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. So he starts out in a much calmer way than some of the other psalms we've considered. In you, Lord, my God, I put my trust. I trust in you. Do not let me be put to shame, nor let my enemies triumph over me. No one who hopes in you will ever be put to shame, but shame will come on those who are treacherous without cause. Shame, shame, shame. Now it is true, the experience of shame in the psalmist's world and ours has some differences. The psalmist lived in an honor and shame culture, which has some differences to our world and our culture. Having said that, there are those who point out that some facets of our digital social media world are swinging back in the direction of the kind of culture in which the psalmist lived. So the psalmist lived in a world where reputation and social standing and the family's name were deeply important, and you didn't want to have those damaged, especially not in front of enemies. So the psalmist says, Lord, protect me. Don't let me be exposed, especially to my enemies. Think about it today. Social media world, digital culture, where people are quick to virtue signal, quick to weigh in on every kind of issue just to be sure I'm on the right side of this, quick to do so because I don't want to be criticized, and I certainly don't want to be canceled. I don't want to be exposed to shame. The psalmist doesn't want that. He prays to be protected. Shame fears exposure. So a piece from some years ago from GQ magazine talked about one of the fairly simple but meaningful ways in which that shows up in our culture. It was a woman who wrote the piece, but she was writing about men's tears. She was saying, it's really kind of embarrassing. She doesn't use, to my knowledge, the word shameful, but it's kind of shameful for a man to cry in public. But they do. So here are some of the things that she writes about. She says, male crying is not new. It's been happening for as long as men have had eyeballs. But it was almost always done behind at least 3 closed doors. So in light of that, she had some rules for men crying or not in public. She said, it's okay to cry if you're in extreme pain. Like, say, a piano were dropped from a 50-story window on your foot. If you're going to cry in pain, though, it had better be at least an 8 on the pain scale. It's okay to cry at certain works of art or film. For instance, if you don't get misty-eyed, she writes, at Toy Story 3, you're a monster. It's almost weird, she says, if you don't sob the first time you hold your newborn baby. No shame in that, bro. I was glad to read that because I did cry, ugly crying. Okay? It's definitely, she continues, weird if you sob during sports events. Although you can cry if you're actually one of the athletes out there on the field. But even then, you should cry only if you win. And if you're just a fan, the rule here is much simpler. Never, ever cry. And then finally, she says, never, ever cry during an argument. She says, sorry, guys, but crying during an argument is kind of our thing. So there are some of her thoughts, some of her rules about men crying in public. And at the bottom of that is the simple reality where she's saying you don't want to experience public embarrassment, public shame. So here's how you stay guarded from that. But that's increasingly hard to do in our world. Kara Powell, the director of the Fuller Youth Institute down at Fuller Seminary, remembers a snapshot from her youth. Most of us have those snapshot memories that we think of on occasion. She remembers a snapshot from her youth. She says, I was in high school. I was walking along down the sidewalk across the playground somewhere. There were 4 or 5 friends nearby. Walking along, I hit something and tripped and just did a faceplant. And she said, all my friends laughed. I was embarrassed, kind of humiliated. But I got up and kept going, and pretty soon it passed, and I was done with it. But, says Powell, if that had happened today, and one of those friends happened to have on their camera and caught it, then they uploaded. And now for the rest of my high school, she says, and maybe even into college, I keep being re-embarrassed as it continues to show and as people continue to laugh. Shame. It's a reality in our experience that has some positive aspects, but many negative ones. I've concluded after years of walking and talking with people, living my own life, studying us as human beings, that shame is one of the principal drivers of obsessive behavior and of addiction. People who are shame-based do things to try to liberate themselves from that shame. The late actress Anne Heche said, my father abused me when I was a child growing up. And she said, I spent many years in my life doing everything imaginable, sleeping around, doing drugs, getting drunk, living on the edge. And all of it, she said, was an attempt to get rid of the shame in my life. And none of it worked. It only added to the shame. So what do we do? If you came to worship this morning looking good on the outside but feeling very heavy on the inside, almost incapacitated by shame because of something you did or because of something that was done to you, what do you do? Where do you turn? Where does the journey toward healing begin? I said earlier, I want to say 2 things today about shame, just 2. The first one is that shame fears exposure. But the second thing I want to say is this: shame is healed by disclosure. While shame fears exposure, shame is healed by disclosure. So let's go back to Psalm 25. This time now we circle back around to when he comments on shame again in the midst of his popcorn prayers toward the end of the psalm. In verse 20 he says, guard my life and rescue me. Do not let me be put to shame, for I take refuge in you. So it's clear from what the psalmist says here that finding refuge in God will be his protection against the shame. But what does that mean? What does it mean for him to find refuge in God? He doesn't really elaborate on that here. Now, when you look at this psalm, you'll notice that it has a simple superscript or title, we might say, right at the head of the Psalms, 2 words long, of David. 2-word superscript, of David. So we're looking at a David psalm. There is another psalm, actually one of my favorites, that I think helps us understand how God can be a refuge for us. It's Psalm 139. And in the superscript of that psalm, while it's longer, it includes those two words, of David. So again, in Psalm 139, we're looking at a David psalm. And he says something in this psalm that can help us understand how God can be a refuge to us in helping us heal from shame. So I want to read 2 verses at the beginning of that psalm and 2 verses at the end of that psalm. Here is how Psalm 139 begins. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. What David is saying there is simply, God knows. God knows me. Now, just on the face of it, just at that level, that's not particularly comforting. Because if shame fears exposure, and then along comes David and says, God knows. It's like, that's not helping. God knows. And it's true. That's what this whole psalm is about. God knows. Think of how that affects our lives. That half-gallon of Haagen-Dazs you ate by yourself last night, God knows. That mean-spirited review you anonymously left on Rate My Teacher, God knows. That little white lie that you told to your boss last week, God knows. That fight you had with your spouse where you said things you told yourself, I will never say again, and you said them with heat and with anger and with intent to hurt, God knows. That hookup, anonymous one night, God knows. That fifth that you drank almost by yourself and blacked out, God knows. Every facet of our lives, including especially those that create shame, God knows. I want about right there to say, David, you're not helping. You're not helping. You say he knows everything about me. He knows what I'm thinking. He knows from far away. He can see the look on my face. God knows. Okay, David, you got to help me more. So what David does in this psalm is he begins to unpack then the kind of God who knows everything about us, the loving, the good, the ever-present God, the accepting God, so that by the time he comes to the end of Psalm 39, we're going to read the last 2 verses, notice how he ends it. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Now, when you read that, you say, now, wait a minute. Over here, he said, God knows all. And now over here, David is saying, standing before God, throwing open the chambers of his heart and soul, standing emotionally naked before God. He's saying, I want you to know me, to see me, to test me, to search me, to know everything about me to the degree that you can tell me things about myself that I don't even know. How are we to make sense of that? Maybe simply this way. Remember our words, exposure and disclosure. Exposure, just the word itself implies that we may not have any choice in the matter. That somebody, something, some website, whatever the case might be, is exposing us in all of our ugliness to the world. Exposed. It's an incapacitating experience of sorrow and pain because there is no nuance of relational realities there, no hint of acceptance. You are just exposed. Disclosure, on the other hand, has agency. You have choice. I make the choice to open my life to and share with someone else, someone that I believe will be in a safe context, somebody who will actually hear me and love me and accept me. Disclosure. David starts by saying God knows it all, and he might as well say, look, he knows it all, so that feeling may result in you feeling like you've been exposed, but hang with me, because as I unpack what kind of God it is that we serve, you will end up on the other end of it saying, God, I want to disclose my life to you because I crave your acceptance. That is the only way, place, and time that I can begin to heal. Could it be that back in Psalm 25, that's part of what David is calling refuge? In you I find refuge. Not just because you know it all, but because I have been able to fully disclose myself to you and be accepted. You remember those words from those two pieces with which we began? Within my earthly temple there's a crowd, remember that? That ended up saying, from such perplexing care I would be free if once forever I could determine which is me. That one line that said, in every life there are chapters we don't read out loud. Put yourself back in that mindset. Because I want to read you some words from the late theological ethicist Lewis Smedes. You have to be kind of in that mindset, remembering who we are, that we all have those things that we fear to be exposed. Our shame says hide, but our disclosure says open and share with God and trusted people, hoping for acceptance. So that's the experience Smedes is writing about with God when he says this. We are accepted, by God that is, we are accepted in our most fantastic contradictions and our boring corruptions. Accepted with our roaring vices and our purring virtues. We are damaged masterpieces, stunted saints. There are ogres and angels in our basements that we can hardly tell apart and that we have not dared to face up to. For the whole shadowed self each one of us is, grace has one loving phrase. You are accepted. 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 Grace heals our shame at the beginning. Not by taking all our shame away and not by separating the sheep of undeserved shame from the goats of deserved shame, but by removing the one thing all our shame makes us fear the most: rejection. Nothing that could make us unacceptable will keep God from accepting us. And is not that, after all, the reason that shame makes us want to hide and fear exposure? Because that we fear if we are seen for the true person we are, we will be rejected. I don't want anything to do with you. And so what Smedes is saying is, what the psalmist is saying is, you can find a refuge in God when you fully own and disclose yourself to Him. No more running. You are accepted by God. And that is the foundation on which healing and growth can be built. So for any of you, dear friends, who have known that sting, that grip, that power of shame in your life, who have known the reality that says shame fears exposure, I want to remind you that shame is healed by disclosure. That coming before God in the full truth of who we are, we discover not a God of rejection, but a God of acceptance, who will take our lives and make of them something beautiful. So wherever you are today, friend, my invitation is very simple. Come before God and a deeply trusted friend or two, and be real, be honest, disclose. Because the journey that begins there is the beautiful journey with Jesus. Gracious God, we've all known the grip, the sting, and the pain of shame. We pray, Lord, that in you we would find the beauty, the joy, and the grace of acceptance. In Jesus' name, amen.